Hi, I'm Kanban Dan and welcome to my virtual training room. My name is Dan Brown and I'm sometimes better known as Kanban Dan. I've been an Agilist since 2006, mainly using Scrum. I started using Kanban in 2012 and I am now an accredited Kanban trainer with the Kanban University, a professional Scrum trainer with Scrum.org and an authorised instructor with IC Agile. Above all, I'm a practicing coach. I work with real people who really do this stuff to get real benefit. What drives me is helping people having better working lives, getting more done, meeting their passions, meeting their goals, getting the stuff done that makes them choose to work where they work in the first place. Today we're going to talk about complexity. Complexity is a complex topic, I'm afraid. So this video is going to focus on just an entry point into that, so that you can use it to start getting some advantage and some benefit in the decisions you're making on a day-to-day basis. Many people think Agile is a choice. Do I use predictive methods or do something empirical like Agile? And it turns out it's not really down to you, or it shouldn't be. The work already knows what you need to do with it, which approach suits it best, and that's what we'd like to do, help you make that decision better. So what about complexity then? I truly believe that complexity is the best leading indicator we have to determining which approach suits the work we're about to do. So if we don't think about complexity, we don't understand what's going on. The typical question we do have to think about in the organisation is there something we should do with a predictive approach or something we should do with an empirical approach? What do I mean? Predictive project management, where we try and predict what's going to happen from the very start. We try and control our budget, our resource, our timeline, and get things done often with phase gates and so on. So that's a predictive approach. Whereas what we mean by empirical is we don't actually know a lot at the start, and we have to actually start doing something and learning from those doings. So we measure and learn by doing real work towards the goal, and that actually seeds the next work that we do. Let me use a metaphor. Which car is the best? You've probably already thought of something, but which car is the best to complete a 100-mile journey? If that's the only information you have, what cars do I mean? Let's show you some cars that it could be. It could be a Ferrari Roma, straight from the 2021 lineup, a lovely GT car. How about a Tesla Model 3 Performance? Super fast, super economical, good for the environment. What about a Ford Focus? Ford sell an awful lot of Focuses. They're a really good family car, economical, fairly cheap to buy, cheap to insure, cheap to run. What about the Queen's Land Rover Defender? Which is the best car? Well, you're going to answer me, obviously, Dan. Obviously, it depends. And what's it going to depend on? You're going to start talking about things like, what's my budget? What's the weather? What's the terrain? What speed can I go? How many people are making the journey? How much space do I need in the car? Is a two-seater enough? Does it need to be comfortable? What about noise? How clever do I have to be able to drive the thing in the first place? Am I a good driver or a bad driver? Does the car need to do a lot of self-driving? Do I not actually want to control it most of the journey and let it drive itself? What about the environment? Won't somebody please think of the planet? So there's going to be lots of different considerations. You've probably thought of a few more, but I'm going to say this is the primary consideration. This is the terrain that we're going to have to make this journey on. Anyone still thinking about that Ferrari or the Tesla? Yeah, right. There's an obvious choice for this terrain. So understanding the context in which we make the decision is absolutely key. In this case, the key constraint is going to be the terrain that we have to make the journey on. If it's a muddy, ploughed up, wet, nasty thing, it's obviously going to be the Queen's Land Rover. Because complexity is such a complex topic, we need a handle, a way to get into it. Luckily, David Snowden has invented Cynefin, which is a sense-making framework, which helps us to understand the domain of complexity which is dominant in what's going on in our environment right now. Notice I use the word dominant. You're never in one domain of complexity. You're typically in all of them all of the time, but one will usually dominate what's going on. So having a sense-making tool allows us to understand that and therefore make a decision based on the dominant domain of complexity that's affecting us right now. Let's address the word Cynefin itself. It's obviously not an English word, it's actually a Welsh word. So as I mentioned, David Snowden invented Cynefin and he's Welsh, and he decided to use it at a conference once and just to really regale against all the Japanese words often used in our industry. And he chose this word, which is very appropriate because there is no direct English translation. It kind of means a bit like habitat, but it's the domain of your existence. It's the area you come from. It's where you belong. There's a much more sense of belonging to the word than just habitat. It's kind of, the valleys of my fathers where the beer was good and the coal was nutty and all those good things. But, there's much more sense of belonging to the domain rather than just meaning domain itself. And that's kind of appropriate because things do belong to these domains. How many domains are there? There are 5 domains that are mentioned in Kinev. Yes, you can divide them into a smaller group, but 5 is where I'm going to start for simplicity. The first one I want to talk about is clear. So let me just draw that. Clear is the bottom right hand corner of Kinev, and it relates to things where we have a really ordered understanding of what's going on. It's part of the ordered group of domains. It kind of means we all understand what's going on here. Let me make it real. Not many of us have actually worked in bars or pubs and had to change barrels of beer. But if you watch somebody changing a barrel of beer, you'd really understand pretty much all of the steps going on and why they were happening and how to do them. If you then had a go at it, you'd probably get covered in beer and waste a lot, because in this domain there is a best practice. Best practice is appropriate in the clear domain because it's well understood. Because of that, we can just follow the steps in best practice and we will do it well. And anybody can learn. There is a certain amount of expertise, but it's not really that dominant. In this domain, we have very fixed constraints. So we're going to know what we're going to do with changing the barrel, why we're changing the barrel, who's changing the barrel, and how they're going to go about doing so. And we can really fix those constraints down to that best practice. So the approach to this domain is sense, categorize, and respond. We need to change the beer for the Doom Bar. Who's the most recent employee who we trust to do this job on their own? Let's send them down to the cellar and tell them to change the Doom Bar. They do the work within those tight constraints, within those fixed constraints, using best practice, and say, right, Doom Bar's back on, and now we can respond and see, is it working? Is it working fine? What's the next thing we should do? Nice and simple. If only all of the world fell into the clear domain, then, well, there wouldn't be much profit out there because actually complex tends to be aligned with where the money is. It turns out risk and reward are somehow linked. So there isn't much risk down in this clear domain. It's fairly straightforward. The next domain to think about is the complicated domain. I do want to be absolutely clear. In this model, we are using 2 different words, complex and complicated. They mean different things. Complicated is still an ordered domain. It's just got a higher level of expertise. You really have to understand things at a slightly higher level. So if you have to train for a long time to do a particular kind of work, it's probably complicated. So in the IT world, being a software engineer is a complicated practice, if you like. You have to go and learn how to do it. You have to hone your skills and your craft to become good at writing software. Similarly, testing, you have to go and hone your craft. You have to do your time. You have to learn lots of things. There are many roles I could say like this. Most specialist roles, in fact, do complicated work. But the one I'm going to use in my example here is someone I love watching on TV. In the UK, we have a program called Repair Shop, where people bring in old artifacts that they have that have been in their family sometimes for generations, and they have a skilled group of artisans who use their skill and expertise to repair these things. If there's anything clockwork, then this is the guy that's going to be doing the work. He's called Steve. And Steve, I think, can probably fix any clockwork mechanism. If it's a mechanical mechanism, something from the clockwork era, clockwork technology. It doesn't matter if he's seen it before, he'll be able to fix it, he'll be able to understand it. Now, if I was to look at the mechanism he's looking at there and say, dear watcher, if he was to turn that cog 360 degrees, what would happen on the face to the hour hand? And you and I would go, I don't really know. But Steve would just start counting teeth. He'd look at how many gears are interacting with how many gears, and he'd be able to give you an answer. Give him a piece of paper and a pen, and just something to count things, and probably 2 pairs of glasses. He is the expert in that domain, and this is really where the experts live. You can be an expert in all of the domains, absolutely, but this is where typically we think of expertise landing. What kind of constraints? Well, we have governing constraints. So it's not as tight as the fixed constraints we have in the clear domain. It's more, these are the parameters within which you can work, where it's safe to work within this space. They're still fairly tight, but they're not as tight as we'd have in the clear domain. And similarly, the practices are slightly different. We use good practices rather than best practice. We don't have one practice to rule them all that everyone should always conform to. We have multiple competing good practices. If you got a load of horologists, people who fix clocks together, and said, how would you approach fixing this clock? You'd probably get from 20 horologists at least 5 different good practices in ways of actually approaching that work. Which one's right? Well, for each of them, the one they use is probably right. They're experts, right? Why would we take our expert and retrain them to do things in a way that doesn't make sense for their expertise? They already have that. It's the old Steve Jobs quote. I don't hire great people and then tell them what to do. I hire great people and get them to tell us what they need to do. I may have paraphrased that one slightly, but you get my point. So we have good practices here. The approach we take when we found this domain to be dominant is sense, analyze, respond. See what's going on, perform some analysis using some expertise, and then respond. So it's a bit more complicated than the clear domain. Who'd have thought? So we have to start using our expertise and using analysis. Next, we're going to jump to the chaotic domain. The chaotic domain is kind of an emergency situation domain. It's where something critical has gone wrong in the organization, or something in your life, like, I don't know, it's the middle of the night and the house is on fire and you need to get your family out. This isn't an area where you're going to say, right, everybody, let's get together and have a planning meeting, is it? It's much more of a, we need to deal with this situation right now. And things are fairly chaotic around us. Things are changing and we're not sure what's changing and how they're changing. There are no constraints going on in this domain at all at the moment. Absolutely no constraints. In actual fact, one of the best ways to get out of chaos is to add one constraint immediately, as quickly as possible. Because adding a constraint will make things clearer for us, and at least we've got some course of action. So, what kind of practices work here? Well, actually, don't worry about practices. Novel practices tend to come out of this domain. So if you're in some sort of crisis and you survive the crisis, the practices that were successful may now become good practices or best practices even that are used elsewhere. There are examples of this from firefighting on wildfires in forests or in bushes in Australia. The story that Dave Snowden uses is a group of firefighters in America, and the fire's out of control. Now, these forest fires go really, really quickly, up to 70 miles per hour. And when the wind changed, this group of firefighters who are trying to fight this blaze realised they're now cut off from their vehicles and the fire's coming towards them. In general terms, they think, oh God, we're dead. There's nothing we can do to survive this situation. We can't run at 70 miles an hour. Of course, many people did try, but that probably didn't end successfully. One person thought, hang on a minute, and decided to set fire to the ground around them. Now, when you're scared and trying to flee from fire, setting fire is not the first thing you normally think of. But what he effectively made was a personal fire break. He burned the combustible material around him before the main fire got to him. So when the fire did get there, it came through at 70 miles an hour. And of course, it's hot and it was horrible, but he's in protective gear and he survived. And now the important thing is that's best practice. If you're going to go and fight a forest or a bush fire and you find yourself in that situation, as many of you as possible set fire to stuff, make a fire break, huddle together in the middle. You've got more chance of surviving that way. But you say, I mean, it's a novel practice. It's not something you're going to think of. The phrase that always jumps into my brain when I think of this is, necessity is the mother of invention. It's amazing in times of crisis, in times of war, in times of pandemic even, solutions emerge which probably wouldn't have come up at any other time, and approaches that we probably never have, got our act together and sorted out, happen so that we get things done and get out of the crisis. So how do we work here? Well, if you're in chaos, the first thing you've got to do is act. Then sense, and then respond. Notice act comes before sense. There isn't time to stop and think about things very deeply. We aren't going to have that planning meeting. We need to act. It is not a safe to fail environment. The house is on fire and my family is inside the house. I need to get my family out. The first thing I must do is act. Then I might say, right, are we all here? I'm in an act of sensing now. And then, okay, we're all here. I can call the fire brigade. Respond. Perhaps tell the neighbours, because they might catch on fire too, because they're close enough. So we need to start responding after we've done the initial action. Now we can add that constraint. The fourth main domain is complex. What do we mean? This is still a side of Cynefin that's what we call non-deterministic. That means cause and effect are not connected on this side of Cynefin. When we talk about clear and complicated, if you do this, you will get that. Cause and effect are coupled. We know that we can repeatedly do the same thing and get the same sort of outcomes. That's not the way it is in complex and chaotic. Sometimes doing the same things will lead to different outcomes, and cause and effect only become tightly coupled after the event has happened. So we're trying to solve a problem that we don't really know what we're going to do yet. This is typified by things we've never done before. The example I'm going to use is nuclear fusion. Nuclear fission is what we currently use for nuclear power stations and so on. It's quite a dirty process, splitting atoms, giving off a lot of energy. But nuclear fusion is what stars do. They combine hydrogen atoms to make helium and give off a huge amount of energy as well due to Einstein's relativity. E equals mc squared. You get a lot of energy for a little bit of matter. So when we get to fusion power stations, we'll have clean energy with a byproduct of helium, which is really useful as a refrigerant in CAT scanners and other medical equipment as well as scientific equipment. So everything's good there. There's very little bad to come out of a fusion reactor. So it's infinite clean energy effectively because hydrogen is plentiful. We have a lot of water. Water has got 2 hydrogen atoms per molecule. We've got an awful. There's more hydrogen in the universe than everything else added together. So that's great fuel. However, we don't know how to do that yet. Stars can do nuclear fusion easily, but doing fusion on the planet, well, we've done it in fusion bombs. That's not so great. But we are actually starting to run experiments. And this is the correct approach for something that's truly complex. You run experiments and learn empirically what to do next. So you build something that's the smallest practicable fusion reactor you can with current understood knowledge. Then you run experiments in there, see how much energy it uses, currently more than it gives out, but that's fine for the outcomes learning, not energy in this particular example. And you use the learning from that reactor to seed the experiment for the next reactor and for the next one. I believe we actually have plans in Britain to have a working nuclear fusion power plant in 2040. So how do we work in the complex domain? So it's not ordered like clear or complicated. So the constraints are different. They're not either governing or fixed as we use in the ordered domain. But similarly, we're not in chaos either, so we don't have no constraints. What we have is enabling constraints. That's a weird concept to get your head around, but a good friend of mine, Tobias Mayer, told me this story. He says, I used to have a really good art teacher at school, but sometimes he was a bit lazy. And when he was lazy, you'd come into the class and say, could you all just do whatever you want? And very strange things happened. Some people would just sit and have a chat with their mates and not really do anything. Other people would draw what they're already very good at. They might be really good at drawing the human eye, for example. So they'd show off to their friends effectively the skills they already had. But no one was really learning anything in that free form. There were no constraints. Nothing was really useful. But other times you'd bring in a tank of stick insects and say, hey, you've got to draw what you see in the tank of stick insects. Drawing a tank of stick insects is kind of dull. You know, they look like sticks, right? So you've got sticks on sticks in a tank. This isn't a really exciting topic. So now you have to think about, within those constraints, what can we do? What can we do that's interesting? Oh, look, I can see a reflection of a tree or a building or something in the tank with that there. So maybe I can actually focus on those and have the foreground out of focus and the background in focus. I've never tried that before. So by having the constraints, it caused creativity to happen. So enabling constraints are about setting things to allow you to succeed. Practices are different here too. We don't have good practices because we don't know how to solve the problem yet. Doesn't make sense to have a best or good practice when you don't know what you're doing, right? So we have either exaptive, as Dave calls them, which is basically practices are exaptive if they're practices that work for one thing that we're trying to reuse and see if they're effective here too. So we're trying an experiment, if you like, and using practices from another area here to see if it works or not. Or we have emergent practices. These are practices that emerge when we try and do something. It turns out when we're doing Agile stuff, we might try this thing and, oh, it really works when we have those people working together in a little triad, a little trio of people where we have different brain types or different experiences of skill sets working together to try and solve the same problem. Oh, there's a practice that seems to work. Let's try that. So that emerges from something we just tried. So it's all based on trial here. Trial and error. Sound familiar? Well, actually, the way we run it is probe, sense, respond. Now, remember in chaotic domain, it was act, sense, respond. What's different here is probe is a designed, safe-to-fail experiment. A designed, safe-to-fail experiment. So we actually have a think before we try an experiment using pretty much scientific method. Here's my hypothesis. Here's the experiment or the probe I've designed. Here's what we'll do to measure that. And here's what we'll do if that goes well. And here's what we'll do if that goes badly. And now we've got a nice little time box potential experiment. It might not be time box, but hey, we can decide up front. And this all leads to a probe. So we probe, sense, respond. And what works, we do more of. And what doesn't work, we do less of. This is an empirical approach. We do something. We don't think about something. We have an idea of what we could try, and then we quickly get into doing it, but we make sure the thing we're doing is safe to fail. If you're running an experiment at work, nobody should get sacked as a result of the experiment. That seems, unsafe to fail. No one should feel like they're no longer valued in the organization because of your experiment. You need to make them safe. They're the four major domains, but there is a fifth domain. It's been recently renamed to confused, so all the domains now have a C letter. Confused is quite a good name. And that's where you are if you don't understand the domain of complexity that's dominant right now. So you just might not be looking at complexity. So the complexity is quite confusing in that sense. So how does that affect things? Well, confused is not typically a good domain to be in. It's an unhappy place. You're likely to get things wrong. Why is that? Which approach do you take when you don't know what kind of constraint you're in, what kind of situation you're in? Which vehicle do you pick if you don't know you're going to be on that muddy track? You go with your gut, you go with what you're used to, you go with what you like, you go with what you want to do. But it might not be appropriate for the work because you haven't actually understood the complexity of the work and what it needs. We see this an awful lot when you see projects failing, when you hear about big public spend projects, IT projects that haven't succeeded. It's usually because they were trying to use a predictive approach in a domain of complexity that did not suit a predictive approach. Because we don't know which approach we should take, we go with our preference, we go with our bias, we go with our default. And that tends to lead to unhappy outcomes. So if you are confused, The first thing you need to do is work out which of the domains of complexity is dominant. Have I got a nice racetrack or have I got a muddy path? That will help you seed the decision of the correct approach to take to move forward. If you've got something that's fairly complex, something that's a domain of complexity that means you've not done this before, or no one in the world has ever done this before, it might not even be possible, then you're in that complex domain and you need to try and do an approach that's going to move you quite quickly into complicated. We're trying to simplify the domain of complexity we're in. The way we do that is by running these experiments, probe, sense, respond. If you look at Scrum, a sprint, a good way of describing it is an experiment. It's a time box in which we run an experiment to try and get a sprint goal done. And we have an increment at the end, which is done, which is based on that experiment. And it'll either pass, fail, get results, lead to learning. We might have found a new way not to do it. We might have found a thing that means we don't want to do any of this stuff, it's the wrong market. Or we might find something that's actually a step in the right direction and we get some value from it as well. So there's all those things. A sprint is just an experiment. Same thing in Kanban. We're going to try and change one thing using scientific method. It's an evolutionary improvement method. So it's all about looking at taking experiments to move us forward in Kanban to become more fit for purpose for your service. I hope you found this a useful entry point in understanding Cynefin as a sense-making framework to understand the complexity that you're already in. If you want to know more about Cynefin, please look at the links that I'll put underneath this video in the description in YouTube so that you can link it to Dave Snowden's work and perhaps get involved. If you want to know more about Kanban or Scrum, please feel free to look at my other videos. I'll be more than delighted if you subscribe to my channel. And if you want to look at the classes I've got coming up, please look at kanbandan.com. I hope you've enjoyed this and I hope you found it useful. Thank you.